Expertgruppen för biståndsanalys, EBA, är en statlig kommitté som oberoende analyserar och utvärderar svenskt internationellt bistånd för att det ska kunna förbättras och utvecklas. EBA har 10 ledamöter med kompetenser från olika biståndsområden och ett kansli som verkställer besluten. Förutom våra rapporter så ordnar vi seminarier, workshops och möten mellan olika parter. Varje år sammanfattar EBA sin verksamhet i årsberättelsen Biståndsanalys. Den kan beställas från kansliet eller laddas ner på eba.se. EBA har ett oberoende i relation till uppdragsgivaren regeringen, liksom i relation till vad som utvärderas, samt till de rapportförfattare som anlitas. Rapportförfattarna ansvarar själva för slutsatser och rekommendationer i sina studier. Allt vi producerar som rapporter, seminarier och vår podcast EBA-podden finns tillgängligt på vår hemsida.
Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this webinar, which is entitled Implementing a Feminist Foreign Policy, Lessons from Sweden, and which is organized by the Expert Group for Age Studies, also EBA. My name is Sara Johansson de Silva. I'm a former member of the expert group and I have the pleasure of moderating the seminar today. Through seminars such as this one, the expert group wants to create a platform to discuss issues of high relevance to development cooperation in different shapes and forms. And today we're going to do that by taking a starting point in a report that was recently published by EBA, which was called More Than a Label, Less Than a Revolution, Sweden's Feminist Foreign Policy. It was written by a team of researchers, which includes Anne Towns, who's from University of Gothenburg, professor there, Elin Bjarnegård, associate professor at Uppsala University, and Katarzyna Jezierska, associate professor at the University of West. And I want to say also that this report is available at eba.se, the website of the expert group, for those who want to download it. So a few things about this report. It focuses on the bilateral implementation of Sweden's feminist foreign policy, so it leaves the multilateral side aside. And the main objective of the report has been to explore if this policy led to a change in how the gender equality work was actually executed, both the extent and if it changed the way that things were done. And the point, of course, is to inform future work and see if there are lessons learned for other countries in this. And some background now to today's webinar. So Sweden launched its feminist foreign policy in 2014 as the first country in the world. But since then, some 12 other countries have adopted different versions of feminist foreign policies. So Canada and Colombia, who are both represented today in this webinar, are also pursuing feminist foreign policies. And some of the questions that we will focus on today include what can be learned from Sweden's experiences of implementing a feminist foreign policies? Are there lessons for other countries? And are there lessons more generally in how you steer and implement foreign policy, not just feminist ones? What are the experience of other countries when it comes to formulating, steering and implementing a feminist foreign policy? And do these policies have an impact? And if so, how? And what are the big things that make a difference? What we will not discuss is whether countries should adopt a feminist foreign policy or not, because the report doesn't look at that. What we're hoping to achieve with this is to provide not only a better understanding of how the feminist foreign policy was implemented in Sweden, but just more broadly, what does it mean about the steering and implementation of foreign policy, and how and to what extent ideas such as this have an impact on the practical work out on the ground in what is, I think, in any country, a very complex apparatus. So for today's webinar, we will first listen to a presentation by the authors of the main findings of the report. And then after that, we will have a panel discussion with 3 invited guests that include Laura Gil Savastano, Ambassador of Colombia to Austria. We have Caroline Dunton, who is Senior Policy Analyst at Global Affairs Canada. And we also have Kjell Engelbrekt, who is Dean and Professor at the Swedish Defence University. And lastly, I want to tell you already that we have reserved some time and opportunity for you in the audience also to pose questions to the panel or to the authors via the Q&A function. And we will open up for that towards the end of the panel discussion, but you're of course welcome to start phrasing your question, putting in your questions when you come up with them as soon as you want to. So that's for that. With that, I leave the word to Ann for the presentation. Thanks, Ann.
Thank you, Sara, and thank you everybody for tuning in. We're really grateful for the interest in the report and the seminar itself. Sara gave you some background. I'm also going to start with a little bit of background before I start talking about the report itself and its findings, and just so everybody's on board. So Sara said in 2014, then Foreign Minister Margot Wallström, a Social Democrat, launched the Feminist Foreign Policy, and that was groundbreaking in several respects. I mean, for one, it was the first time the so-called F word was used in this way as a foreign policy goal at the highest level of government. But it was groundbreaking in other ways. It was supposed to be included now, the feminism and gender equality in all foreign policy carried out by the MFA. I mean, previously, Sweden had worked with gender equality issues primarily in foreign aid. But now it was to be extended not just to foreign aid, but also to trade and promotion, and to foreign policy and security issues. It was also to be carried out by the entire foreign service affected, not just the MFA itself in Stockholm, but all foreign policy agencies, the multilateral missions, the 91 embassies that Sweden has in different parts of the world, and so on. Right? This launch created surprise, not just abroad, but also in Sweden. It generated a lot of debate around questions like, what is a feminist foreign policy? What is feminism really, right? What makes a foreign policy feminist? Initially, the government didn't have answers to those questions, but they quickly started developing some answers. So they developed the concept of the 3 R's that you might have heard about. The idea that there should be equal rights, equal representation, and equal resources, and that should guide Swedish foreign policy. A little bit after that, they developed a 4th R, which was that there was also to be a reality check that you were to work with, or they were to work with feminist foreign policy in a way that resonated with the reality in which the policy was pursued. Then last fall, in 2022, Sweden had elections and a change to a right-wing coalition government. And on his very first day in office, the new foreign minister, Tobias Billström, retracted the feminist foreign policy. And his argument was, and here I quote, that, quote, the use of the label feminist foreign policy has obscured the contents of our policy. This is why the government will discard its use, end of quote. So it was not a rejection of gender equality as such, right, but a rejection of the label, so to speak. That retraction came in the middle of our work with the report. So we had been working with the report for about 10 months, and then came the retraction. So we were able to incorporate the question of the effects of using a feminist label into the report. And as you can see, we also worked it into the title of the report. So there's a lot of scholarship out there addressing the questions about what a feminist foreign policy is and what is feminist and so forth, and whether you should have a feminist foreign policy. Our report asks a different question, that is, what became of the feminist foreign policy? What became of the policy declarations in practice, when the policy landed in concrete action in all these embassies and agencies that are spread in different parts of the world? See, we can't assume policy to be self-executing, right? Because foreign policy, as Sara said, is a complex apparatus. It has lots of actors that are posted around the world. And Swedish steering of foreign policy makes it perhaps particularly complex. Swedish foreign policy is organized through agencies and embassies that work as formally autonomous organizations. They get some general directives from the political leadership, but they're free to implement those directives as they see fit in any given context. So the report then focuses on the implementation of the feminist foreign policy, as we see a need, and EBA saw a need to ask, to what extent and how did lofty policy declarations were they implemented in practice? Sorry, nothing's happening to as I'm trying to click on there. Perfect. Very good. The report was commissioned by EBA, so it focuses then, not surprisingly, on countries, primarily on countries with which Sweden has had aid relations, but its focus is all more general than that too. There are also already reports and reviews of feminist foreign policy in Sweden's multilateral work, and I think Professor Engelbrecht will be able to speak to some of the multilateral work that Sweden has done on feminist foreign policy. But at the time that we wrote the report, there was no systematic knowledge about implementation in bilateral relations. So ours is the first systematic study of bilateral implementation of feminist foreign policy. And it's a huge study. It tries to get a big picture grip on the bilateral implementation across all these agencies and embassies. And the report addresses several questions. First question is, what directives did public agencies and embassies receive from the Swedish government? Second question is, did public agencies and embassies do more and or different gender equality work after the feminist foreign policy was launched? Third question is, did the implementation differ between the Ministries for Foreign Affairs' three main policy areas? In other words, did it differ between foreign policy and security, trade and promotion, or development cooperation or aid policy? And then finally, we also asked the question, what role did the label feminist play in the implementation? And before I hand the word over to my co-authors, I would like to just say a few words about the research design of the study so they understand the scope of our claims and how we arrived at the conclusions. So the design then, we focus on this time period from 2008 to 2022. And that is so that we can compare the period before the feminist foreign policy was launched again in 2014. So we can compare 2008 to 2014 to the period after the launch to see what kinds of changes they were. There's a focus on the MFA's agencies and embassies that have some relation, that work with the relations to the 40 countries with aid relations to Sweden. So the focus is on foreign aid because it's an EBA commission study, but it's also broader than that. The material we look at is huge, okay? We look at well over 500 government documents. We conducted 2 very large surveys with all Swedish diplomatic staff at all Swedish embassies. We have about 30 interviews with the top political leadership and other staff in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, but also in 2 embassies, in Bogota, in Colombia, but also in Nairobi in Kenya. And finally, the study actually consists of several sub-studies. So there's one study that focuses on the agencies within the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, one focuses on the embassies, and one focuses more on the label itself and the steering. And with that, I'm going to hand over the word to my colleague, Katarzyna Jezierska, and let her take the word from here.
Thank you, Anne. So here you see the list of all the agencies and public corporations under the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs that we looked at. So there are 9 of them that we grouped under different policy areas for clarity, just to show you how many different organizations we looked at. Next slide, please, Anne. And the first question we asked was, what directives did these agencies receive from the Swedish government? So we looked at different types of documents that are steering these agencies. And can you take up the table, please? This table here summarizes those our conclusions in this regard. So the light green boxes that you can see, they indicate presence of gender-related goals and tasks in those steering documents. The darker green boxes indicate presence of goals and tasks that are framed as feminist foreign policy directives. So can you click again? So when we first look at the empty boxes in the top row, this is the Security Agency Inspectorate of Strategic Products that deals with regulating Sweden's arms trade. And as you can see, they were never instructed, as far as we can see in the steering documents, never instructed to work with gender equality goals. Can you click again, please? Then when we look at the development cooperation agencies, they all were instructed, and already in the beginning of our study period, so even before the feminist foreign policy was launched, to work with gender equality goals. And systematically throughout the period that was the case, one of the agencies started getting such instructions after the feminist foreign policy launch. And then in the middle, the last group of organizations or agencies, these are all dealing with the policy area of trade and promotion. Here we can very clearly see that the this launching of the feminist foreign policy had a clear impact on the instructions that they were given. So after 2014, all of them gradually got instructions and directions or directives to work with goals and tasks that had to do specifically with feminist foreign policies, with the green, darker green boxes. So one thing to observe is that all those steering documents, they are quite short in nature, though they're very short in formulation, which means that what we can observe reading through them is that the government gave the instructions that these agencies should be working with gender equality or feminist foreign policy, but not how they should be done, how this should be done. Next slide, please. So the next step in our analysis was to look at what did these agencies actually do with those directives. So some of them received directives, some not. We went through the whole set of annual reports for the whole study period and conducted interviews at those agencies. And take up the graph, please. Yes, thank you. So the graph first is a simple summary of the initial stage of the analysis that we did, which was counting of words related to gender equality in those documents, right? So there were thousands of pages of documents that we went through. And first checking for all words that we could relate to gender equality. And we observed two things. One is that the development cooperation agencies, the gray line that you can see, has a clear upward trend after 2014. So even though these agencies were never instructed to work with feminist foreign policy, they still upped their game. So they worked even more with, or reported even more work with gender equality. And also we see a clear differentiation or variation between the different policy areas, right? Some worked more, some worked almost nothing with those things. But apart from the simple counting of words, we the major part of our analysis was the qualitative analysis of all those documents and the interviews. And the summative conclusions there confirm this picture, the picture they can see, right, from the counting. So yes, development cooperation agencies, they intensified their work with gender equality after 2014. We cannot see that the security agency, the Inspectorate of Strategic Projects, the blue line in the graph, that they did any reported any work with gender equality in their annual reports. And when it comes to trade and promotion agencies, they slowly started taking up new tasks related to gender equality after 2014. And here's one footnote only, that one of those agencies, I mean, you can see that there were 4 agencies in this category. One of these agencies had one specific project that was linked to the promotion of the Swedish Sex Purchase Act. So this is why their line, the orange line, is not entirely flat in the beginning. And we did see this is actually the only project that could be linked to gender equality that any of these agencies had. After the launch of the feminist foreign policy, so after 2014, all trade agencies started to varying degrees working with some gender equality work. So we can see entirely new engagements, right? And this means that the conclusion here is then that the change is biggest in this group of organizations or agencies. So the change is most visible, but it also is related to the fact that they started from a very zero line, basically, right? Most of them did not work with gender equality before. And until the retraction of the feminist foreign policy in 2022, they never caught up with the organizations and the agencies that most engage with gender equality. So with the development cooperation agencies that are still at an entirely different level of engagement with these issues. So in sum, we can conclude very briefly that yes, those agencies, all MFA agencies that we looked at, except for one, did more gender equality work after the feminist foreign policy was launched. So we see a clear effect there. Thank you. And over to Elin Bjarnekort.
Thank you. We can take one more step then down the implementation ladder to take a closer look at our survey results. We sent, as Anne mentioned, a survey to all Swedish foreign missions and to staff members who work in some way with program-related activities. So not support staff, but everyone else received a survey in order to assess also to what extent these independent but agencies received steering and changed the way that they worked and what they did. So if you press some of the main conclusions based on this survey, I will also give you some more exact examples later. But we do see, as you have already heard, strong signals. We see in country strategies, for instance, that there are signals about gender equality, and more so after 2015. Although the feminist foreign policy is often not mentioned in the development cooperation country strategies, we see stronger signals about gender equality. But we also see loose steering. So these embassies, and if you move forward, are independent agencies. They are tasked to implement the feminist foreign policy and gender equality in the way that they see fit in their context. And that is also something that we clearly see in the survey, basically because we see a lack of patterns in the implementation. So if you move ahead as well, it's been very difficult to see any clear geographical or strategic priorities. Basically, we see differences, but it's not clear exactly what those differences depend on. And one thing that's also good to mention and to bring with you is that when we ask staff in Swedish embassies about whether they think that the feminist foreign policy strengthened gender equality in the country where they were posted, they generally think that yes, it did have an effect. It's of course a biased sample in the sense that they were also tasked with working with this, but it's nevertheless useful to know that they, for the most part, felt that it was useful and did make a difference. And we can move on to the next slide to take a closer look at some of the questions that we asked. And as mentioned also, the focus is on embassies in countries with which Sweden has development cooperation. But in order to be able to compare, we sent it out to all embassies, all Swedish embassies. So we can also see if there is a difference, which is interesting because the development cooperation has such a long tradition of working with gender equality. One of the questions that we asked was whether there was a gender focal point at the embassy. And this was one of the things that we clearly heard, that every embassy was to have a gender focal point. There was a list of gender focal points at all embassies. So this was one of the kind of clearer signals that was sent from the government, that this is one of the things that we should see in all the embassies. However, when we asked embassy staff if they had a gender focal point, not all of them were aware that they had a gender focal point. So we don't know if the no answers here actually means that they didn't have one, or if it just means that they weren't aware that they had one. We see a significant difference here as well between aid embassies and other embassies, where a larger share, 78% of staff at aid embassies claimed that they had a focal point, but less than half of staff in other embassies reported that they had a focal point. The difference is even greater if we zoom in even further and look at staff members at development sections in embassies in development countries, where a full 81% think they know that they have a gender focal point. So this is also an overlapping mandate because SIDA and Swedish Development had worked with gender focal points in their embassies for a long time, even before the feminist foreign policy was launched. So again, we do not know to what extent this was actually an effect of the feminist foreign policy, or whether it was also the fact that in embassies where this had had a longer time and where they were used to working with gender focal points, that you actually reported that there was such a person in place. We can move on to the next slide, where we have taken a closer look at whether embassy staff received training. And here we distinguish between general gender equality training and specific training on feminist foreign policy. So the training on feminist foreign policy can be seen as a kind of subcategory of a more general gender equality training. Overall, about half of the respondents have received internal training on gender equality, and about 1/3 received specific training on feminist foreign policy. But that also means that almost half of the respondents had never received any training on gender equality, although they were tasked with implementing a feminist foreign policy. Again, we see a big difference between aid embassies and other embassies when it comes to training in gender equality. Specifically, 60% of those in aid embassies and 40% of those in other embassies have received training. And again, people working in development sections of embassies have received the most gender equality training. But when it comes to specific training in feminist foreign policy, it is actually other sections in development embassies that have received more. So we see a different kind of pattern when it comes to specific training on the feminist foreign policy. And what's important to know with this graph is that training seems to matter. The people who have received training self-report that they have better knowledge of the goals and methods of feminist foreign policy than those who do not report to have received any training. And we can move ahead. And then, of course, the question is, did the feminist foreign policy actually change how people worked and what they did? So in this graph, we focus only on those who have worked in foreign policy since before 2014. There's a large turnover, but here we zoom in on the people who have a long experience in foreign affairs so that we can assess change. Did those people actually see a change when the feminist foreign policy was launched? And this is about half of our respondents in total. And when we interpret these graphs, it kind of depends on what you expect. How much did the feminist foreign policy change? It doesn't say anything about what was done before, the level of gender equality work that was conducted before the feminist policy, but it does say something about to what extent it was seen as something new. So as our title says, we think that these numbers above average when it comes to giving more attention to gender equality, but also doing things differently, using new methods. It's certainly more than a label. People think that it has actually, to some extent, been generating new methods and that they have given more attention to it. But perhaps it's also less than a revolution. There is not a complete, invention of new methods, doing things in completely new ways and devoting a huge amount of time to doing it. So it was reported that things change, especially perhaps in terms of how much they focused on gender equality, but to some extent also to what extent they developed new methods. There are no differences here between different types of embassies, but what these figures hide is that those who changed their approach the most were local staff and those who had received specific feminist foreign policy training. But interestingly, also men and women's practices were equally affected by the feminist foreign policy, so we do not see any gender differences in these graphs. And with that, I leave the word back to Anne.
All right. Thank you, Elin. So now just to wrap up, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what the main findings are from the report in sum. we could see from all this, from all these various studies, all the material that we analyzed, that feminist foreign policy was a very, very clear steering signal. So some of the interviewees that we spoke to said that this is the clearest steering signal they've ever seen in their long careers as diplomats, right? So it was clear to everybody that the Swedish government directed them and directed agencies and embassies to work with gender equality after 2014, often referencing expressly the feminist foreign policy, with one exception, we should say here, right? The Inspectorate for Strategic Products. The steering was clear, but it was not very specific. So the agencies did not get very much specific direction in terms of how they were to use with this or any specific goals. They were told, do feminist foreign policy work as you see fit. It's also clear from the material that the feminist foreign policy had effects, right? It's clear that the agencies, the embassies did more gender equality work after 2014. That work was more of the same, we should say. It's not that they did that feminist meant something entirely different, that they went in a different direction, but rather more gender equality and gender mainstreaming work. It's also clear that the feminist foreign policy involved an array of working methods. We also looked in the report at how the MFA agencies and embassies worked with feminism or gender equality. And we can see that they worked across the spectrum. They provided funding for actors that work with gender equality or feminism. They provided training or feminist foreign policy and gender equality. They engaged in norm promotion, trying to promote the idea that gender equality is a good thing among a bunch of different actors. And they got to work disseminating facts and assembling facts on gender equality or gender inequality situations around the world, and what changes when you bring about gender equality. It's also clear that implementation differed between the different policy areas within the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. So we saw the least change within security policy, as we said. The Inspector for Strategic Products, which deals with arms trade, which is something that Sweden has been heavily criticized about, right? That they have not integrated feminist foreign policy in arms trade. The Inspector for Strategic Product was not directed to change anything or to work with gender equality, right? So it was not touched by the feminist foreign policy. On the other hand, the kind of foreign policy work that the leadership of the embassies and the leadership at the MFA engaged with multilaterally, that did involve quite a bit of promotion of feminist goals, right? And I think, again, Professor Engelbert can talk a little bit more about that later. Trade and promotion saw the biggest change in one sense, in that they had not worked with gender issues at all before the feminist foreign policy was launched. So for that area of foreign policy, this was entirely new. So in a qualitative sense, that was the biggest change brought about by the feminist foreign policy. And then in terms of development cooperation or aid policy, that's in quantitative terms where we saw the biggest change. They already, FIDA and the other development agencies already were working with gender equality issues before the feminist foreign policy was launched. But they increased that work quite a bit after the launch of the feminist foreign policy. So in quantitative terms, that's where we saw the biggest change. So then, to get to the last question that was posed, the role of the label feminist in implementation. What can we say about that? Well, for one, I think it's clear that to some extent, right, the feminist foreign policy, the feminist terminology really was repackaging old wine in new bottles, right? It's not as if it meant different kind of gender work, right? Feminist means essentially the same thing as gender equality, right? Again, 3 R's: equal rights, equal representation, equal resources, right? So in that sense, right, the feminist really was like kind of a new label. Also, that language, feminist language, never became dominant in the foreign policy machinery of Sweden. Right? So gender equality continued being used more frequently than feminism. gender equality was used much more frequently, especially in aid. In SIDA and the development cooperation, they never really took to the feminist language at all. In fact, the feminist language tended to be used most by foreign policy leadership. The ambassadors, maybe the heads of section, and the leadership in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and in the foreign mission. And let me say a little bit more about language and framing, what was used. So if we take a look at the slide, this is from the survey again. We asked about the different communication strategies and the so-called frames, right, that aid staff embassy staff used when they talked about feminist foreign policy, or when they talked about gender equality, rather, And the results here, I think, are really interesting, right? That 75% of staff said that when they talked about gender equality, they framed it in terms of a universal value, okay? So not a particularly Swedish thing, right? But something that belonged to everybody. It's a shared value across, right, universal. 70% of the staff said that they used economic arguments to try to persuade people that gender equality is a good thing, right? That gender equality promotes growth and so forth. We know this is effective, so it's not surprising that 70% use that frame. But then we get to the specific feminist foreign policy frames. They were not used quite as frequently, right? So we have the 3 Rs that about 50% or half of staff said they used, right? And then if we look at the use of feminism, that terminology, only 25% of staff said that they framed gender equality work in terms of feminism or feminist foreign policy. We also asked about whether it's ever framed as a local or national tradition, because we also know from research that that's also quite an effective framing. That's not used very frequently, often at all, right, by Swedish staff. So less, around maybe 20% or a little more. So about the use of feminist terminology, it's hard to know how to interpret that that 25% used feminist terminology, right? If the expectation is that all staff should use feminist language when you have a feminist foreign policy, then 25% is not very much, right? But on the other hand, if we consider how controversial and complicated and difficult to interpret the concept is, then perhaps 25% is quite a lot, right? So it's not clear how to interpret that. But it is clear that the feminist language never became dominant in practice, right? That there were other frames that were used more frequently. We should also say that even though the feminist terminology was a label or repackaging in some sense, the terminology was never merely a label, and that's really, really important, okay? And because it did work, and it did several important things for Swedish foreign policy. For one, it was an incredibly powerful signal, again, of the heightened ambitions of the social democratic government and coalition government with respect to gender equality. This was a way, right, to kind of shake the foreign ministry out of the tired work with gender mainstreaming, right? Gender mainstreaming had become bureaucratized. It lacked momentum. It just didn't create any excitement. But with this new terminology, right, you could like shake people up a bit. A signal that the government is serious, right? That we need to step it up and have higher ambitions with gender equality work. In doing so, right, it also strengthened Swedish international leadership in gender equality. This is also quite clear. We've heard this both from Swedish staff that were involved in this, but also we did a survey with partners and external actors that also said that it strengthened Swedish leadership, right? And we've seen this from other reports as well. Not surprisingly, using feminist terminology also heightened tension with gender conservative forces. This is a controversial term, right? It can be interpreted to mean a lot of things. And we did receive reports from people we interviewed that it was, often or could become like tense, right? When you brought this up. That's also what the terminology was intended to do. So that's not really that surprising. And then finally, one final thing that we want to highlight that the label did was that it brought different policy areas under one umbrella concept, right? You have, again, trade and promotion policy, development cooperation policy, and security policy that often in Sweden kind of function as downpipes, so to speak. That's what Swedes say, right? That they're separate downpipes. And with the feminist label, it came to conceptually unify this policy, and it also provided opportunities to break these downpipes with more collaborations, right? And not least at the embassies. So at the embassy level, we see a lot more collaboration, right, between sections because of the feminist foreign policy. And so with this, we're almost at the end now. We hope you found something useful in this report, right, to bring with you. But before we end, I would like to say a few more things about what else may be instructive about the Swedish case. Okay, so just a few more points and then we're done. And I think the biggest kind of argument that we want to make with this report, and I don't think this is a surprise to anyone, but still, is that steering matters, right? And with that, implementation matters. How you steer a feminist foreign policy will have consequences for how it's implemented, right? And here we have a few points we would like to raise. One thing to think about in steering is how the feminist foreign policy is organized at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. And there are some trade-offs or alternatives here. Like, do you create a unit that kind of directs the feminist foreign policy with a team, right? Or do you do what the Swedish foreign ministry did, have a small team and then try to outsource, right? To make sure that feminist foreign policy belongs to everybody in all parts of the organization, right? That's one thing to think about. How this is organized and what the connection is between the unit in charge of feminist foreign policy and the other parts of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and the embassies and the agencies. And here we see some trade-offs also in what to think about in terms of steering. One of them has to do with what I just mentioned, this idea about staff ownership, that feminist foreign policy is something that belongs with everybody in the organization versus, to some extent, that it's something that's asked for by leadership and that it comes as a directive from leadership and where you're accountable to leadership. And to some extent, these things are trade-offs, right? Because the more there's a sense that this comes from above, and the more specific the feminist foreign policy directives are that come from the political leadership, in a sense, you can imagine the less ownership you feel on the floor, right? Because then it's not your question to kind of decide and to implement as you see fit, right? And here we have heard from quite a few people that we interviewed that many Swedish diplomatic staff ask for that they would have liked a little more detailed directives in terms of what to do, what goals to pursue, the indicators that they should try to meet and so forth, right? But it's hard to know here what the right thing to do is. But this is clearly, I think, instructive that this is something to think about, whether, again, like to make sure, to let people decide for themselves out in the embassies and agencies how to do this, or whether you get more directive and more that you're supposed to be accountable to the leadership. Right? Another trade-off has to do with how much flexibility there is in contexts, right? Versus, whether you implement leadership directives. So in other words, like how much, same point in a sense, but how much detail should be in these directions, right? Or how much can you flexibly contextualize what it is that you're supposed to do? Finally, there's the question of funding, and that is crucial in a number of different ways, right? I think many times feminist foreign policy comes as a directive and it comes without any funding necessarily attached, right? But we know that obviously all activities cost money, right? So we see, or we saw from the people we interviewed, a clear kind of, they were asking for kind of more funding, which then comes with directives to report back, but also providing them the resources to do this, right? Because you get a new directive and it kind of crowds out something else that you're doing, and it costs money to do so, right? And in the Swedish case, much of the feminist foreign policy was supposed to be executed without any additional funds, right? So it was within existing means. So, and that's a thing to think about also, right? Like, how do you fund this thing? From what? Making sure that it's not primarily a talking shop, but also something that's allowed to cost money, right? But I will end with that and then turn this over to the other panelists. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anne, for this thought-provoking presentation, I think. And again, the report is available at the EBA website for those who want to read it in more detail. Without much ado, I want to go on and introduce the other panelists who will join Anne for the discussion. First, Laura Gil Savastano, who is ambassador of Colombia to Austria, and she's also non-resident ambassador to Croatia, Czechia, Slovakia, and Slovenia, and permanent representative of Colombia to the United States in Vienna. But, and this is important, she also served as Vice Minister of Multilateral Affairs from 2022 to 2023, which I think is when the feminist foreign policy was initiated in Colombia. And she has previously also worked for the UN and as a journalist for several Colombian media organizations. Caroline Dunton is a senior policy analyst in the Foreign Policy Planning Division at Global Affairs Canada. She works on both the development and implementation of Canada's feminist foreign policy. And she's also worked on foreign policy research as an advisor to the Chief Development Officer. And Caroline holds a PhD in political science from the University of Ottawa. And Kjell Engelbrekt is Dean and Professor of Political Science at the Swedish Defense University. He's also Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and lifetime member of the Royal Swedish Academy of War Sciences. And his research areas include, among other things, international relations and diplomacy and security policy. So a very warm welcome to all of you. And I thought I'd just start off by picking up some of the lessons learned, perhaps with relevance for other countries. I think this is what Anne was summarizing at the end. You know, how are you thinking on the steering of this policy? I wanted to start with our guest panelists who are implementing foreign policies, who are beginning to implement foreign policies, feminist foreign policies now. So Laura, I wanted to start with you. I think maybe you can just start with a general question. Why a feminist foreign policy in Colombia? We should say that you are in the beginning of this process. So it's not actually yet it's being formulated, but it's not yet being implemented, I think, right? But so what prompted a need for this specific policy and from moving from business as usual? Please, Laura. You need to unmute.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Well, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And let me begin by saying that we wouldn't have a feminist foreign policy in Colombia if Sweden had not had hers. And the reason why we had one is, I think that the major factors are the following. First, a huge debt with women in Colombia, huge. Two, this government won the election in 2022. And in 2020, 2021, we had major demonstrations in Colombia. This wave of demonstrations in Latin America, led mostly by students, and in Colombia by the feminist movement. And feminist movement, not only women's movement, organizations calling themselves feminist women. And the third factor was that social basis, social movements in the streets, were social movements that brought this government to power. So for us, it was natural for the women who actually took on positions of, middle rank and high positions in the government to think of a feminist policy. And it's the opposite of what you just said. We don't have it yet drafted, ready, published, but we began implementing it. And we began by sort of instinct on how to proceed. And I'll be happy to tell you about that later.
No, Lara, now that you heard the sort of description of the Swedish feminist foreign policy, do you see major differences with the Colombian approach?
I see pretty much the same challenges. We, transfer the same challenges to a country that has a larger debt with the women. You had a tradition of gender equality even before, and you continue pretty much doing the same thing after, reaping the foreign policy of the label of feminist. But on the other hand, I have to say something that I found quite surprising. I did not perceive a lot of
What a cliffhanger.
I'm back. Is Lara out as well? I'm sorry. Let's move on. I'm sorry. Let's move on to Caroline, meanwhile. Caroline, so, you've also heard now the presentation. Do you see any major differences with the Swedish and the Canadian approach? First of all, I should say that you, in Canada, you have had this since 2016, I think. Is that correct? Yes. And it actually applies. Maybe you can explain a little, actually, international, you have a feminist international development assistance. Perhaps you can explain how this extends to the rest of the foreign policy as well. So go ahead, please.
For sure. Thank you for having me. I'm very grateful to be here. And it was really great to read the report, gave me lots to talk about with colleagues. So seeing the presentation was wonderful as well. So our journey to a feminist foreign policy here in Canada builds on decades of Canadian work in human rights, gender equality, much like Sweden, that sort of long-term commitment, as well as a respect for diversity and inclusion as key components of our feminist foreign policy. So we have, again, now been advancing our feminist foreign policy for the last 7 years, and it applies across all of our international efforts, including diplomacy and advocacy, trade and economic relations, peace and security, international assistance, and consular services. So there are a lot of building blocks. One of those is our Feminist International Assistance Policy. So this was published formally in 2017. And through this, it covers all of our international assistance, and we prioritize support through this policy for feminist movements and women's rights organizations. So some of this is different programs that we have, like the Women's Voice and Leadership Program, the Equality Fund, or the Alliance for Feminist Movements. And then more broadly, our international assistance under this policy contributes to improving women's economic empowerment, health and well-being, and sexual and reproductive rights. We also have a national action plan on women, peace, and security. We're in the process of developing our third right now. And it takes a whole of government approach to ensuring the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in peace, security, development, and humanitarian efforts. A third building block is our trade diversification strategy, which helps women-led, Indigenous, visible minority, youth, and 2S LGBTQI+ owned businesses reach global markets. We're working to remove barriers to trade in this process. And our trade agreements also since 2017 have sought to mainstream gender. So I really appreciated in the report that there was a finding that the feminist concept came to serve as a driving force for integration and coordination between the foreign policy domains. Because in integrating it across all of our policy efforts, our goal is to have this sort of feminist approach be at the heart of everything that we do. With the goal of reinforcing our overarching objectives, of strengthening the rules-based international system, supporting lasting peace and security, and fostering inclusive and sustainable development and prosperity. It is also, which I think is perhaps a similarity, to other countries is that it's built on a government-wide feminist agenda. So it's not just in our international engagement. Feminism and equalities are values for the government of Canada as a whole, and domestically. So both domestically and internationally, we believe that all people, regardless of their background, gender, or intersecting identities, should fully benefit from equal participation in economic, political, social, and cultural life. So I'm not sure that I necessarily highlighted differences so much, but I would say my primary takeaway is that there's a lot of common ground between Canada and other countries and findings that came out in the report.
Thanks very much, Laura. We were both you and I were thrown out at the same time for some obscure reason. So, but please, so if we can go back to the discussion about, do you see any major differences in how you are constructing your foreign policy in terms of the building blocks, in terms of the tools, in terms of the steering, compared to the Swedish experience?
Yeah, well, you broke ground. When I started looking, we had a drafting team at the ministry that's still working. And we started looking at the experiences. We realized that a lot of the R's, rights, representation, and resources were expressed through international cooperation, and that it was much harder for the foreign policy to be expressed in substantial matters. What does it mean to have a feminist lens on a trade issue or on a trade agreement? We can say now that we have, for instance, our trade agreements with Canada, as was just mentioned, have gender clauses right now. But it was a challenge for us to look from the global south how to formulate a feminist foreign policy, because when we decided to do ours, only Mexico and Chile had done theirs. And they were at the very beginning. Chile had less than a year. President Boric had won 1 year earlier. They were developing theirs. They had nothing written. They were implementing a feminist foreign policy, but they had not drafted anything. And Mexico had drafted very basic documents about gender equality in foreign service. Then later on, they developed those documents, and now they have, a solid drafted of feminist foreign policy. So we didn't have at the ministry what to look for to see, from the global south, how to look at this issue. So basically, we were trying to see what feminist means for us. And for us, it meant many things. For us, it means aspirational. One of the major critics I face was that, how could you talk about feminist foreign policy in a country that has such huge debt with women? And one of the things we wanted to do from the ministry was to be able to formulate something that was so aspirational that will force the other entities of the central government to follow along. And that for us, I think, is different than how Sweden perceived it. Because for us, it was a drive to provoke change inside. It was not only to bring change at the international level, but to force change within. So we developed a foreign policy that had three major characteristics that were pacifist, because we are defending a policy of dialogue, of negotiated, peaceful settlement of conflicts, nationally and internationally. I believe that all feminist foreign policies have to be pacifist, and that is related to the army issues that we'll comment on right away. Second, intersectional. And for me, the intersectionality issue was as fundamental as the feminist. I mean, the label intersectional is as important as the feminist because we are a country of diverse populations, and we wanted women in all their diversity to be represented there: Afro, Indigenous, Caucasian, LGBTQ. We wanted all groups, all identities, all intersecting identities represented, and we also wanted a participative foreign policy, because for me, feminist leadership for me and for the government meant participation, meant not from the top down, and I think that's one of the major differences with the Swedish experience. It means from the bottom up. So we wanted to bring along those social movements I talked to you about just a second before. So those were the major lines. And although we don't have the feminist foreign policy written yet, I have to say that there is one component of this feminist foreign policy that is going to mark everything else, and I think is going to be able to respond to many of the challenges that the Swedish foreign policy faced. And I'll tell you which one is. Colombia never had a national action plan for Resolution 1325. So, of course, we said, well, if we're going to have a feminist foreign policy, the first thing we need is to have a national action plan for 1325. And 1325, is a resolution that pretty much it's the building stone for the women, peace, and security agenda, but it's 23 years old. So it has nothing of feminist in it. It's very basic in terms of recognition of rights. But at the international level, it was quite groundbreaking. So the way we decided to do this national action plan, and I have to say that Sweden has been one of the founders and one of the major supporters of the process, is to do this with the women and the women from all over the country. We organize dialogues with women all over to ask them what Resolution 1325 meant. And you know what that provoked? It provoked, one, a reading of 1325 in 2022 and 2023. And because that's a security resolution, women's peace and security, it brought all the difficult questions that a feminist foreign policy has to touch, the ones you just mentioned, arms, for instance. For us, the connection between organized crime, weapons, and drugs, and the feminist view on that. And I think that national action plan, which is taking the learning of all the national action plans. I mean, some countries are going through their 8th or 9th version of their action plans. It's taking all the learning. It's not going to make the mistake, and it's going to permeate the feminist foreign policy. Solving one major question is funding. You cannot have a feminist foreign policy if you're not willing to put some money into it. And the thing we're doing with 1325, or they're doing in Bogota now is to make sure that 1325 means commitment by national entities and funding in their budgets. And I think that's going to permeate how finally the general feminist foreign policy will be done. So I'm hopeful.
No, sorry. No, I wanted to say so that's a way of making sure that the steering signal is kind of going through towards the end to towards implementation is the funding that you're coupling to it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, thanks very much. I wanted to go back to, I think this is exactly going back to what Anne was talking about. You need to think about. So the funding for one thing, I think it also raises very clearly the importance of the context in where that, what kind of country are you, and what is the drive behind this policy. And I think Colombia's situation is clearly very different from Sweden. So, Caroline, I'm going to switch back to you and ask because you have been doing this for some time now. So you are implementing. Do you actually see results, and how do you measure those results? And, do you have this action plan? Are you following up on it? How is that working? I hope I didn't miss any of this as I was thrown out. And if so, just let me know.
No, that's also a great question. Each of our different constituent parts has sort of different evaluation mechanisms, ways that we can measure success, but it's also something we're still trying to work on and sort of grow with. So our Feminist International Assistance Policy follows a sort of longer tradition of measurement and evaluation in the international assistance sphere, which many other countries are familiar with how that would work. And we're able to get sort of a lot of answers there. As we're on the third National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, we've undergone sort of measurement processes for the first two to get some lessons learned for the third. And like anything, I think in public policy more broadly, some things are easier to measure than others. And we're really in the process of working on the next stage of how we look at this umbrella of all of feminist foreign policy, sort of at the macro level, and how, going beyond the measurement structures that we have for individual components. How do we think about this at the higher level? How do we ask some of these harder questions? And this is something that I'm working on in our team. And it's really interesting to get to think about. And we also are collaborating a lot with civil society on these questions to sort of get their input, and also really open to learning from other countries. So things like this report are incredibly useful in the conversations that we're having about how we answer these questions for Canada.
Thanks a lot, Caroline. I wanted, before I go on to open up for Kjell as well, I want to say two things. One thing is to the audience that the Q&A function is open, so you can ask questions there. Please do, and we will open up for some questions towards the end. I wanted to go back to Anne and just see, as you hear these different versions of feminist foreign policy, is there anything in the kind of steering and implementation that you react to, both in the context of how the Colombian one was formed, in how the setup is for the Canadian one? Are there any reflections compared as a comparative study compared to your work?
I don't think I have any reflections. I have more questions, and I'm very interested in Laura, for instance, like why, if I may ask a question, why it is that you think that what it is that makes a global South feminist foreign policy different from when Sweden pursues a feminist foreign policy, or Canada, say. That would be one thing I'm really curious about. And then I'm just curious for both Caroline and Laura, what the conversations are in terms of how you organize internally in the MFAs, the implementation and steering of this, right? Like what the teams look like, if you have gender focal points, or if you have some sort of other organization, like how it's organized. So I have more questions than comments.
Thanks. I'd send that question back to Caroline in terms of the organization. Just how do you actually do this in practice?
Perfect. Thanks. That actually, I kind of put my hand up because there was something I did want to say on that. So that works great. So right now, our sort of overarching feminist foreign policy piece exists in our branch for strategic policy. So in our branch, we're able to see the big picture of what the department is doing. We have folks working on international assistance, on trade, on foreign policy. And so we hold this sort of chapeau piece. We have lots of international assistance specialists in gender equality, both in teams that implement and oversee the FIAP, the Feminist International Assistance Policy. We have gender equality, a team dedicated to gender equality, full of experts with different areas of expertise and focal points. And then we also have our Women, Peace and Security Ambassador, Jacqueline O'Neill, whose role is to have sort of a leadership position and work on implementation and collaboration of our Women, Peace and Security agenda. And there are lots of fantastic people supporting her in her work. Of course, there's always room for improvement. And I think, nothing in a bureaucracy is fixed forever. But we're starting to see, I think as well, shifts in our approach and the work that we're doing. So our feminist foreign policy approach has shifted since we launched the FIAP in particular in 2017. So we've moved towards a less gender binary and a more intersectional approach that recognizes these multiple identities and the social and structural factors that shape people's experiences. And we've grown, I think, through learning from others, learning from our own experience since 2017 to focus on systemic and transformative change that challenges existing norms and power relations. And we've really moved towards trying to implement this transformative approach for lasting change.
Great, thanks very much. I'll save Anne's question for Laura because I have that one on my list, but I'll put it a little bit more towards the end on, what does it mean why is there a difference forming a feminist foreign policy in Colombia compared to Sweden? And I wanted to reach out to Kjell. I mean, you've done a lot of research on diplomacy and security policy, and we've heard a lot about women and security agenda. I think you've looked more on the multilateral side, perhaps in terms of the feminist foreign policy, at least. So it'd be really interesting to hear some views on that. But I think for us also, as an audience, it would be interesting to know, what are the tools and what does in diplomacy, how do you manage to get a policy down to the ground where people are supposed to work with it? And how do you get, how does a policy get traction on the international arena? I know that the last one is something that you have looked at in the context of the multilateral side of the feminist foreign policy. So please, Kjell.
Yes, thank you, Sarah, and hello, everybody. So my perspective and my own research is broader in some sense. I deal with foreign security policy and with diplomacy since decades back. But but it's also narrow in the sense that I especially evaluated Sweden's membership in the UN Security Council and the campaign leading up to that. So the period 2015 through 2018 is the period I've looked at Swedish foreign policy, and of course, feminist foreign policy was a main feature here. I noted that in the report at some point there's an interlocutor from Kenya, number 25, who says that 2015 through 2018 were the golden feminist foreign policy years, and so I wonder if this is not a coincidence. This is the time during which Sweden first had its campaign to join the UN as a non-permanent member, and then served its tenure in 2017 and 18. So Swedish foreign policy in general had much more visibility during these 4 years than in any other period. So I assume this is when also Swedish feminist foreign policy also was kind of brought forward and projected onto the world. So that at least that would be my hypothesis, that there's a relationship here. So I'll make 4 brief observations based on my own research into this particular this field in these 4 years, which I think resonates with the report, which is much more focused on bilateral relations, but also with many of the comments that have been made here by the ambassador and by Caroline and others. So the first would be when I did research on the campaign and the preparations that were done at the MFA for Sweden to sit on the UN Security Council, I was told by the then head of the UN unit at the MFA that they had looked very much at the Spanish experience of trying to bring forward the women, peace, and security agenda effectively and advance that agenda at the UN. And the Spanish were disappointed themselves with what they had accomplished. That's at least what I was told. So they were trying to create a more coherent and consistent approach to which to bring this forward, this agenda forward, and bring women, peace, and security agenda forward at the UN. And it seems to be that the mutual reinforcement of the WPS agenda and feminist foreign policy worked well, and were kind of well designed in that respect, that they really reinforced each other here at the UN and also at the campaign that preceded. So that's one observation. A second observation is also based on my own research, that this coherence and consistency on the part of all the Swedish diplomats and the foreign policy when it comes to the feminist foreign policy and the women, peace, and security agenda is that it yielded a level of credibility to this issue and the way in which it was advanced that perhaps the Spaniards and others had not seen previously. This was told to me by interlocutors from other countries, other diplomats, and at the UN, especially the Secretariat. They told me that the Swedes brought credibility to this set of issues that they hadn't seen before. A third observation is that also the Swedes were able to align diplomatic practices and routines to some extent with this consistent approach. And this was done in part by having female rapporteurs, moderators, and discussants at almost practically every event that was organized by the Swedes, first during the campaign phase, but also during the tenure. And this is again something that my interlocutor said, that everybody took notice that at a Swedish event, that there would always be female rapporteurs from the Middle East, from Africa, and other places. And so that was something that people took note of. And then fourthly, something that became clear to me when I did interviews at the Swedish MFA is that junior diplomats and officials at the MFA and mid-career diplomats who were female felt quite empowered by this whole project of campaigning and then serving at the UN Security Council. There were things like, usually there are 4 levels of decision-making at the Swedish MFA. It was condensed to just 2 levels during these 2 years at the tenure. So it brought the people who are preparing the policies closer to the decision-making level, and thus also very often elevating female experts, desk officers, and so on and forth. So they felt more empowered than in kind of regular policymaking that at the MFA. So these would be my 4 observations, but they kind of underline also what the report says, that is this, does it have a lasting effect, or is it more of a temporary nature? And I think that's basically an open question. It would seem to me that with some of the people who had this experience, for instance, female diplomats, they probably will carry this experiences forward in their own careers, it seems to me. But at the UN, in terms of advancing certain issues in certain arenas and so forth, we know there's a lot of turnover of new people coming in. So I think that's much more of an open question to what extent this will be a lasting legacy here on the part of Sweden and other countries. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I mean, I think you are touching. We don't have so much time left, but I still want to get to an important question. I think you are raising, and now that is the importance of what Anne called the F word, right? Is there a specific, does it matter? And I think you were saying, Kjell, that it did matter in the multilateral arena. I think Anne is also saying that it although it was sometimes used, sometimes not used, at least within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it did serve as a kind of unifying label and something that was aspirational and going further. So I think this is an interesting question. And I think but it's also related to the fact that, gender equality and specifically the word feminism is not always a welcome word. It's not always a welcome discussion point even. How can you advance the agenda in those more headwind contexts, I think? Because perhaps those are the areas where feminism, or at least gender equality, is the most important. I wanted to know, Laura, I mean, do you have a sense of this? Because you have worked a lot in Colombia, it seems to be strongly related to the security agenda and women and peace movement. So is there a specific advantage of using the feminist word or the feminist label?
Yeah, I think it meant a recognition of rights beyond gender equality. It meant that the government wanted to be gender transformative and not only gender sensitive. It meant that it wanted a feminist leadership built from the bottom up and not from the top down. For me, it touched all the right messaging. Someone mentioned here the importance how that drove. It's sort of sexy. For us, it was a commitment with the women's movement. It was to pay back a debt, at least discursively, to begin with. And in terms of the question I was asked, why it's different for Sweden and for Colombia, I will invoke the 4R, the reality check. And I will invoke the 4R to say, you began at a different point than we began. I find it sort of ironic that in societies where, I didn't find that much pushback in terms of the feminist word label in Colombia. Media received it well. It was well accepted. The government went behind it. Both Minister of Foreign Affairs and President are behind the feminist foreign policy fully. And I didn't see the debate turning around the word feminist. The debate turns around, this is hoping for what cannot be done. This is not going to be possible in Colombia. And that's why it's so important for us to look at something that can change things within. For us, the building of the feminist foreign policy is also democracy building. It's building with the people in a country that has a democracy deficit and is coming out of conflict.
Now, I think I will go on with one more question to you, which I think is related to this, and you've almost answered it now, but this is a question. So there's been a lot of discussion. One aspect, a controversy surrounding the feminist foreign policy is that it can be seen as a sort of colonial contract that a country like Sweden then imposes on, for example, it's the countries where partnership countries for development cooperation. On that, is this, you've done your own feminist foreign policy, but how is there an interpretation that is done, or how should one see this?
Well, look, this is something that that's why it's so important for the women all around the country to discuss what it means for them and to build this from within the country with the people, because they're able to tell you what they believe is feminist. And in many, many areas, I see differences between policies defended by European feminists and policies defended by our women. And I cannot tell you which one is more feminist. And that's why we believed we needed our own. Now, keeping that in mind, the report is about bilateral relations. It's much easier. I was working in multilateral, and now I'm ambassador in a place where I have UN headquarters and I represent Colombia before the UN. It's easier to express a feminist foreign policy in multilateral fora because you are mainstreaming gender issues in resolutions, you are taking stance, and you are never alone. I mean, I'm basically sitting with Canada, Sweden, Norway, Chile, Costa Rica. We are not alone. It's much harder at the bilateral level. And at the bilateral level is where you see the major issues. What is more important for a woman, to lose trade because you're not attending the gender clause, or to favor that trade even if it may not have the gender considerations. And those things you have to be able to listen to the women and to see what they need. I have to tell you, asymmetries exist in the world. Your GDP allows you to do things and to talk to partners in a way that Colombia is not allowed to do. The Ministry of Foreign not allowed, not able to do. The Ministry of Foreign Trade is one of the Ministry of Foreign Trade is one of the entities that copied the most quickly the concept of the feminist foreign policy. So they started working on trade for women, trying to favor those enterprises built and staffed by women. But that's something, looking at inside, is not imposing that on a trade agreement, right? I mean, Canada can tell us, we want a gender, labor and rights clause in the trade agreement, as they did. Thank God they did it, because that helped us. I'm a big believer in that sort of conditionality, because I think they provoke good change. But I cannot tell Canada, I want you to improve your labor rights, because I have to have a reality check, right? I can say that in a multilateral level, and I have said it, but at the bilateral, it's much harder, as you probably understand. So my hope is that all our efforts for feminist foreign policy will produce a more equalitarian Colombian society. That's what I hope for.
Thank you very much. Kjell, in 1 minute, just 1 minute. Full term in security policy, this is your area, one of your areas of expertise, even in the bilateral side, or is it a red flag?
Sorry, could you repeat? I didn't hear the first part.
So feminism in working in security policy, which you've done a lot. So just if you can very briefly say, is it helpful there? Has it been helpful, do you think, as a label in security policy, apart from the or is it an obstacle in that area, for example? Using the F word.
I think it can be both, but in many contexts, I think it's quite helpful to have this broader agenda. I mean, that's the human security agenda also that we talk about, and certainly in the UN context, for instance, that becomes very obvious very quickly that how security and military affairs play out on the ground. If you don't have the viewpoints of women and women's issues, that you're going to have a very, very partial and narrow perspective. But yes, it's also true that sometimes there is resistance to the term, as some of you have talked about, and I also know that when Sweden campaigned on feminist foreign policy, it didn't develop that campaign fully in all parts of the world, right? There were parts of Africa where that kind of that aspect, that dimension of the campaign strategy wasn't really much developed, because they knew it could generate also some resistance and some hesitancy. But that's just being diplomatically astute, I think. But when you can't have the same kind of campaign everywhere. You have to be sensitive to local context and operate in the tempo of the context.
Which is one of the conclusions, I think, of the report. For ages here, I'm sure, because it's a fascinating subject, and there's so much competence on the panel. But we have to end this webinar, and I want to thank the authors and who've been listening to us. I also want to say that there's another EBA seminar coming up, which will focus on Swedish development research and research aid. And that will take place on the 24th of November. And for those who are interested, you can register for that on EBA's website at eba.se. I also want to say that there's a link to EBA's podcast, EBA-podden, which is in Swedish, unfortunately, but that can be found also on the website of EBA for those who want to listen to what are usually short summaries, discussions based on EBA reports. And thanks to everyone for attending this webinar, and see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.